Hello, I'm Jan Szrewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On this episode, we're taking a closer look at European diplomacy around the topic of sending European troops to protect Ukraine as part of a potential peacekeeping mission. It seems that while the administration in the United States is busy making headlines with Donald Trump's shock statements, European nations are not exactly speaking in unison. And what better place to hash out these divisions than in the romantic streets of Paris? With the event ironically held close to Valentine's Day, the city became diplomatic battleground where several European leaders collectively decided, no thanks, we're not signing up for a war duty just yet. The story is complex, so without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Sending peacekeeping forces to Ukraine has become one of the focal points of recent international discourse. For Kiev itself, the matter is very clear. Such a force would be one of the few guarantees that could ensure its safety.
The Europeans have 200,000, it's a minimum. It's a minimum. Otherwise, it's nothing.
200,000 soldiers is a tall order. Without the US, NATO would be currently pretty hard-pressed to field such a force. Some European leaders have said that they would not send their troops to Ukraine as part of a peace contingent. Others, like the United Kingdom, are ready to do so, but only as part of a team.
Europe must play its role, and I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement.
It is no secret that the United States is the bedrock of NATO's power. For now, the only signal it has been sending is that Europe should pull its weight.
To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
Russia, of course, already has its troops in Ukraine, and they are anything but a peacekeeping force. They are invaders. Moscow's invasion is what has led to this geopolitical crisis. So it is no surprise that the Kremlin would not look kindly on NATO boots on the ground.
The appearance of armed forces troops from the same NATO countries, but under a foreign flag, under the flag of the European Union or under national flags, does not change anything in this regard.
As negotiations are becoming more of a reality, the situation is bound to get heated. The idea of a peacekeeping force is bound to come up more than once.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. President Emmanuel Macron hosted a summit that was supposed to streamline Europe's response to Ukraine's fight against Putin's invasion. However, the result of the summit was hardly the way he envisioned it. Macron proposed a reassurance force, positioned comfortably behind a currently not yet agreed upon ceasefire line. But apparently that was not enough to keep everyone on board. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, fresh of a campaign trial and in the middle of a nationwide election campaign, bluntly declared that talking troop deployments while the war is still raging is, and I quote, highly inappropriate. Scholz's irritation was palpable, and fairly so, as his constituents would not be too happy with actual military action. Meanwhile, the UK offered to put boots on the ground and even hinted at a partnership with the US, so long as there is a US backstop to ensure that Russia keeps its distance. The idea of a peacekeeping force sounds noble on paper, but what about in practice? Europe is in a bit of a pickle here. On one hand, there is an undeniable need to back Ukraine in its time of crisis. On the other hand, there is the lingering fear of entangling themselves in a conflict that might just drain their wallets, resources, and likely the troops meant to protect their own homeland. And then there is the notion of increasing defense spending. Europe's leaders are racing to bolster their military budgets. President Donald Trump has demanded that European nations ramp up their defense spending as part of his latest peace talk initiative with Russia. As the debate rages on, one thing became abundantly clear. Europe is at a crossroads. It is a crossroads paved with uncertainty, fiscal concerns, and a shared commitment to avoid another full-blown conflict, if possible. But there is also a realization that if Europe is going to be the guarantor of Ukrainian security after a ceasefire, it will come at a steep cost, both financially and politically. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Taras Kuzio, Professor of Political Science at the National University of Kiev Mohyla Academy. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Good morning and thank you for inviting me.
So the question of helping Ukraine following a potential ceasefire is being discussed. When looking at the current situation, what do you think is going to be the final outcome here? Because we don't even have any degree of unity between European countries.
Well, I think it's a bit exaggerated to sort of. I know the media has to do this, that there's divisions in Europe, but I think the real, of course, news and problem is the way in which the United States under Donald Trump has basically thrown a hand grenade into what was 7 decades of transatlantic cooperation, military cooperation especially, and integration. That's, I think, the bigger problem area, shall we say, and the fact that Donald Trump seems to be completely aligning with Russian demands, Russian disinformation about Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. Within Europe, I think this is less divisions. I mean, you're always going to get the pro-Russian camp being against any kind of support for Ukraine, Slovakia and Hungary. But I think that amongst the other countries, that it's less divisions than debate about this very, very complicated and serious question of how to provide security guarantees. What does that mean? How many troops should be sent? I mean, there are so many different options being proposed by different countries. For example, if Russia attacks again, Ukraine should be brought into NATO. This is a Finnish proposal. How many troops are needed and the numbers range from kind of 30,000 to 150,000. So there are so many. And of course, the biggest, sorry to be a long reply, but this is a big question. The biggest, I think, potential problem area isn't within Europe, it's between Europe, United States and Russia, because Russia has rejected the idea that any of the troops on the so-called peacekeeping troops, or however you want to call them, on the frozen contact line should be from Europe. Russia says they should not be from Europe. Russia wants, of course, troops from maybe the global south or China or somewhere, not from Europe. Trump team is completely oblivious to this. They say, no, we're not getting involved, but it should be Europe. But then Russia's saying, no, it can't be Europe. So I think that is, I don't know how you overcome that obstacle. I mean, presumably it's Ukraine as a sovereign country has a right to invite whoever it wants to be the peacekeepers. But this will be part of some negotiations, I presume.
So this is indeed a bit of a non-starter, because that was the key American demand, that European troops are involved. Russia says, no, we're not going to accept them. What should be done in this case? What sort of configuration do you think is viable? Do you think that, for example, Europe could provide an assurance force? That was the exact name that was used in the course of preliminary talks, apparently, between France and the United Kingdom. They envisage a small number of troops, about 30,000, but they would be based outside Ukraine, providing perhaps air support, air defense. But would that be enough? And also, who would police the contact line, if not European troops?
Well, the contact line would be presumably still Ukrainian troops. Behind them would be, as you say, these kind of 30,000 troops. I've seen a map today where they will be based in 3 locations: Poltava, Kryvyi Rih, Zelensky's hometown, and the city of Dnipro, formerly Dnipropetrovsk. They would be a kind of a tripwire, shall we say, that if the Russians tried something again, then they would respond. But, the big debate is how would they respond? What functions would they have? Would they be covered under some kind of Article 5? Trump, I think, would be against that. But I think the bigger problem is, as well, as where are the troops going to come from? Where are you going to get 30,000 troops? Germany, of course, can't decide yet. because it's in the middle of an election. Maybe the Christian Democrats who will come to power will be more amenable to sending German troops. The British have agreed. Macron typically can't make his mind up. You know, a year and a half ago, he was all in favor of sending European troops to Ukraine. Now he's saying French troops won't go. Sweden is in favor. Poland, surprisingly, thinks it will not send troops. And yet Poland has probably one of the best armies on the continent. So,
what do you think should Poland do? Because that's really is an interesting question. There are arguments going both ways, both against sending troops and in favor of sending troops. What is your take on that when it comes to Poland's position?
Well, I think Poland should. It doesn't have to be many troops, but I think, you know, it's a question of kind of showing support, shall we say. I understand the Polish position is that the countries on the front line are threatened the most by Russia, and they probably need their troops to be facing Russia directly rather than sending them into Ukraine. But, you know, of the 30,000, if only 500, say, or 1,000 were Polish, that still would be an important signal. The Baltic states, of course, are smaller countries. They're on the front line as well. How many they can send is another question. Finland has an incredibly good military system with a huge reserve force. Maybe they can send some, but they have a huge border with Russia. So I think all of these questions are up for debate, and there is still no sign of. We don't really know the outcome yet. I mean, the EU obviously has to step up now and take the commanding position. Trump is lying about how much aid has gone to Ukraine, because all the figures I've seen show that the European Union has sent more military and more non-military aid to Ukraine than the United States. But the question is, you know, will the US stop sending its portion of aid to Ukraine? The EU is going to expand the amount it's sending to Ukraine, which will be, I think, unveiled on the 23rd of February after the German elections. So all of these questions are up in the air. But yes, the question of security guarantees is also clouded by Ukrainian distrust. Let's not forget this. Ukrainians distrust Western promises because of what happened in 2014, when the British and the Americans ignored their commitments under the Budapest Memorandum to provide security assurances to Ukraine when Russia first invaded. So there's a whole massive area of different factors that need to be resolved.
And why do you think Trump is actually using such controversial language? And by saying it's controversial, we're actually downplaying it quite a lot. I mean, he seems to have repeated quite a few inaccurate statements about Ukraine, suggesting President Zelensky's approval rating is at 4%, whereby it's more of 50%. Also saying that President Zelensky is a dictator, which is manifestly untrue. Why do you think this is happening now? Could that be the backlash over the failure to sign the deal for rare earth minerals, or something else?
No, it's deeper. It goes back to 2020 when Trump blamed Zelensky for his first impeachment. Because remember, there was the whole impeachment was surrounding a phone call between Zelensky and Trump, where Trump tried to pressure Zelensky to launch investigations of his opponent, Biden. And Zelensky said no, he's not getting involved. This was also, by the way, a Russian operation. Russia was feeding disinformation about Biden at the time through Giuliani, the lawyer. So I think it goes back to there. Trump is a very vindictive person. He never forgets somebody who slighted him, like Zelensky then. There was also then a lot of disinformation about the Ukrainian embassy in Washington and Ukrainians supporting the Democrats over Trump. So it started there, and then Trump's personal financial greed over the mineral question, I think, then took it further, as it were. And also, there's also this Trump long-standing infatuation with macho leaders. You know, he loves cuddling up to kind of macho strongmen, even though he's not a strongman himself. This is a guy who bribed a doctor to get out of being sent to Vietnam. So there's all sorts of these different questions there. Plus the kind of things he reads and watches. He obviously reads social media and watches news programs which repeat Russian disinformation propaganda. Then he repeats that, and they're all lies, of course. I mean, Trump has a lower personal rating amongst Americans than Zelensky has amongst Ukrainians. I mean, that's the reality of the. But he is it's his personality, I would say, more than anything else, and his dislike for Zelensky going back at least 5 years, if not longer.
It is also quite ironic, because if he's looking for a strong leader to look up to, there you have President Zelensky. I mean, he doesn't use body doubles when appearing in public. He doesn't hide in bunkers. He actually traveled to the front line, and he's a strong leader of a country at war. But, I mean, as you said, it's sometimes difficult to gauge Trump's reasoning in this regard. But there have also been other suggestions. A former British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, actually weighed in on that and said, look, Trump might be saying things which are manifestly untrue, but he's not doing that out of spite. He's doing that to shock Europeans into action. And he also said that Europe should confiscate the Russian sovereign funds as soon as possible, 300 billions, in fact. Do you think that Boris Johnson could have a point there? After all, he was pretty much the first Western leader to travel to Kiev during the war. So it would be difficult to say that he is not a friend of Ukraine. But he is defending Trump in a situation where Trump is difficult to defend. What do you make of that?
Well, Boris Johnson's ideologically aligned with Trump because he was the leader of the Brexit campaign in 2016. And so he's kind of positioned himself on the populist, kind of nationalist wing of the Conservative Party. Yes, Russophilism doesn't exist in Britain. So Boris Johnson is not unique here. I mean, there's pro-Ukrainian positions throughout the British political spectrum, on the Labour as well as Conservatives. So I don't think it's just Boris Johnson, but Boris Johnson is desperate to show that he's correct about Trump. I hope he is correct, but I think Trump has gone too far in, for example, giving away negotiating positions to Russia before negotiations begin. I mean, Trump is not using the strength of the West that could be used against Russia to force it to come to the negotiating table. Trump is not accepting of the fact that Russia's in a very weak position today. By May, there will be 1 million Russian casualties. The Russian economy and finances are not great. Russia will run out of Soviet military equipment by the end of this year. This shows a position of weakness that the West could exploit. Trump is not doing that. Trump is also always criticizing Europe and Ukraine, but never once has criticized Putin and Russia. This is all, I think it tends to show that Boris Johnson is on a losing streak here. I know why he's doing it. He wants to be proven that he's correct about Trump, but I think he's wrong here.
Professor Taras Kuzio was our guest today here on Eastern Express. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And now we move on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Media reports say that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has assured European countries that Washington will maintain sanctions against Russia until a peace agreement has been reached. American sanctions have affected Moscow's banking, gas and oil industries, among others.
Despite the recent controversies surrounding US-European relations, Washington's top diplomat has taken a more reassuring tone. Rubio suggested that lifting any sanctions currently imposed on Russia would be part of peace negotiations and that concessions would have to be made by all sides. The US Secretary of State noted that sanctions would not be lifted until a settlement has been reached, according to Bloomberg. He also said that the European Union would have to join the negotiating table at a certain point because of the sanctions the bloc has imposed. Europe's current role in the negotiations to resolve the war in Ukraine is uncertain. US President Donald Trump's special envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, has said that Europe would not be directly involved in the talks, but that its interests would be considered.
EU member states have agreed to impose a new set of sanctions on Russia. The new package includes a ban on imports of Russian aluminum.
The new round of sanctions will be formally adopted by the EU's foreign ministers on Monday. In addition to targeting Russia's lucrative aluminum sector, the new measures will also hit Moscow's so-called shadow fleet of vessels. This group of ships is used by Russia to circumvent Western sanctions on its oil exports. The new set of EU restrictions will blacklist an additional 73 vessels. The EU is also targeting more Russian banks in this latest round. The 16th package of sanctions comes as the US administration seems to be blindsiding both Ukrainian and European partners in an attempt to hold direct talks with Russia to end the war in Ukraine. While US officials have said that the EU will eventually play a part in the talks due to the vast number of imposed sanctions, some European leaders and officials have been critical of the US's approach.
The former commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Valery Zaluzhny, has neither confirmed nor denied a potential run for president. Zaluzhny currently serves as Ukraine's ambassador to the United Kingdom.
The former military commander said that he will answer a question about his potential candidacy only once Ukraine's statehood is no longer at risk. He added that any political future comes second to the task of protecting Ukraine's sovereignty. His comments come after Donald Trump called on Ukraine to hold presidential elections. Zelensky's term officially ended in May 2024, but elections cannot be held in Ukraine as long as martial law continues to be imposed due to the ongoing Russian invasion. Trump's declaration was a response to Zelensky's criticism about Ukraine not being invited to the US-Russian talks in Saudi Arabia. The Ukrainian president also referred to Trump's claims that he has 4% of voter support, saying that the number comes from Russian sources.
Turkmenistan is seeking to join the growing trade action between Europe, Central Asia and East Asia. The country is currently working on infrastructure projects in hopes of joining the so-called Middle Corridor.
Turkmen officials have reportedly taken part in a multinational meeting with officials from Azerbaijan, Georgia and Romania. The talks apparently focused on facilitating east-west trade. In an official statement by the Turkmen Foreign Ministry, the country is set to sign a deal to create a new trade route as part of the Middle Corridor. Observers note that this transit agreement may take a while to be finalized. This is because Turkmenistan is regarded by some as a fickle negotiating partner, as was the case in its gas swap deal with Turkey. The Middle Corridor, also known as the Trans-Caspian International Transport Route, is a massive trade route from China all the way to the European Union. It serves as an alternative to the northern route through Russia and the Southern Ocean route which runs via the Suez Canal.
And for this edition of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.